Good afternoon, everyone. So excited to be here this afternoon. My name is Phyllis Lockett, and I am the founder and CEO of Leap Innovations. And I am thrilled to have one of my mentors and just an icon who is leading such amazing work in the science of learning development, Pamela Cantor, Dr. Pamela Cantor, who is the founder and senior science advisor for Turnaround for Children. And Pam, I've never told you this, but along the journey, right, you always meet these extraordinary people that change your trajectory along the way. And years and years ago, you and Todd Rose spoke at the Aspen Ideas Festival. And I was there on fellowship, through my Crown Fellowship program. And I heard you and Todd. And I heard you talk about your incredible story. Well, part of it in terms of your journey to become such a leader in the space. And I'd love for you to share that with the audience.
Sure. There are many reasons why a person decides to go to med school. But mine were really clear. I went to med school to study trauma, how it affects children's bodies and brains, so that one day I'd be a doctor and I'd be able to work with kids and help them heal. The reason for this was that I knew trauma as a child. I grew up in a neighborhood with a lot of cousins living nearby, and so there were always sleepovers. And when I was 6 years old, I was sleeping at a cousin's house, and my uncle came into the room where I was sleeping and sexually abused me. I don't remember how many times this actually happened. But what I do remember is that I was terrified to tell my parents. I was afraid that they wouldn't believe me. And when I actually did get the courage to tell them, it was because I had had this dream where I saw myself dying, and I knew that I had to tell them what had happened. But when I did, they were really, really angry. My mother, for many years after that, couldn't really care for me because she was so ashamed. And my father seemed angry at me all the time, and I couldn't understand why they were angry at me and not him. But this shame got buried in our family and affected my childhood and our life together as a family, literally until the day they died. My parents' deaths were separated by a decade, but for both of them, their last words to me were, "I'm sorry." So I did get help one day. I was 15 years old, and I met this absolutely amazing, amazing psychiatrist who was this big man with a booming voice and a great storyteller, and he looked at me and he told me that I was a pearl in an oyster, not this ugly, dirty thing that I thought I was. And I thought to myself, this is a person who sees into me. And so you can imagine one day I walked into his office and I said, "I'm going to be a doctor." And he smiled and he said, "Of course you are." And I thought to myself, does he not know that I haven't taken a single science or math class, that I have been an art major? And he looked at me, and like with everything else, he was the reason I wanted to do it, but he was the reason who made me believe I could. That's how it started.
Look past your circumstances and saw your potential. So
literally.
Yeah. Yeah. So your pathway changed, and after the 9/11 aftermath. Tell us about that.
So I should tell you a little bit about what happened in med school, because I think it's important to have a little bit of frame for what trauma does to kids. And when you go to med school, one of the incredible mysteries there that gets unpacked is that you learn that there are biologic mechanisms that explain everything we're able to do as humans. And not just how our hearts and lungs work, but how we love, how we attach, how we nurture, and most of all, how we heal when things go wrong. So in med school, there were these two big ahas right away that I didn't expect. One was that doctors study illness to learn about health. They don't just study illness to learn about illness. Because when they see these patterns of what happens to patients and they recognize them again, then they're able to understand how to help someone get healthy again. But the second big aha was that the most powerful set of forces that determine what causes these mechanisms to go awry is context. And by context, I mean environments, relationships, experiences. And then what we learned was that not only does context drive our biology, for good or bad, but context also drives the expression of our genes. So if I tell you that we all have 20,000 genes in our genome, and in our lifetime, fewer than 10% are going to get expressed. Well, what determines which is in that 10%? It's context. So context can be a positive thing or a negative thing. The most common naturally occurring example of negative context is something we all know. It's stress. Okay, a negative context in a child's life can trigger the release of cortisol, which goes through the body and the brain, and has dramatic effects on both health and our learning systems. But there's another system called the oxytocin system, the trust-love system, that's triggered by the most powerful example of positive context. And you know what that is. It's the human relationship. So when we feel cared for and that caring is consistent and it's filled with trust, oxytocin gets released, and oxytocin is the more powerful of the two hormones at the level of the cell. It actually protects a child from the negative effects of cortisol. So one of the things that's so important to remember here is that a child's brain is malleable. It's made up of tissue that is the most susceptible to change from human experience of any tissue in the human body. And what drives its differentiation and development is context.
So Pam, talk to me about, and the audience, about how the context effect of what you learned about the kids that were impacted by 9/11, and the learning of what you're describing in terms of the adversity of what
Absolutely.
Children in poverty face, how that connected the dots for you to launch Turnaround.
So in the post-9/11 era, which was 2001, I was a practicing child psychiatrist. 9/11 happened, and the Department of Education wanted to do what became the largest epidemiologic study of an urban public school system, asking the question, what was the effect of 9/11 on New York City's public school kids? So you have this survey that is citywide, and what the data showed is that the children who were manifesting the greatest symptoms of trauma were not in the ground zero schools. They were in the schools in communities of deepest poverty. So
can I just pause on that one? I mean, how incredibly compelling that is, that kids who were directly impacted by 9/11 had less trauma than the students that most of America serves now are experiencing on a day-to-day basis. It's incredible.
And one thing that I'd add to the word less is recurrent. Because one thing we learned about the kids in the ground zero schools is this was one event in their lives. And so, yes, it was terrible. And they all had reactions to it, but they recovered. They were resilient to it. But when we went to visit schools, And I'll never forget the story of walking into a first grade classroom and having this little boy show me a drawing of 9/11. And this drawing was 2 little boxes in the background with smoke coming out. And in the foreground were 2 stick figure boys with guns pointed at each other. And I looked at this little boy. For him, context was local. Context was him walking into his school frightened and not being able to learn. So when we talk about how context gets inside, and cortisol and oxytocin and all of these things that I've just told you about, what I was seeing was this on an enormous scale. This was an education system in New York then that wanted to do everything it could to improve academics, raise test scores. That's what that's what was going on then. Well, to some degree still now. But here's the thing. There was seemingly not an awareness of what stress does to the developing brain, to the learning brains of children. And what's worse, if you up the academic pressure on kids, okay, who are experiencing this kind of stress, what happens? The kids were all worried about just fall farther and farther behind. So that's when I left my practice, founded Turnaround for Children, on this idea that we could create tools, services, and practices that could turn any school into a positive developmental force in a child's life. And to this day, that's what we do. We have 1 foot in science, 1 foot in practice.
Which is incredible. So you left a very lucrative practice to launch a nonprofit to really drive this knowledge, this science, into learning. So, you know, can connect the dots for us on how the lack of understanding of context is undermining how our current education system is enabling potential or unlocking potential in our students.
Yeah. So when we think about what was known that built the 20th century education system, okay, first of all, it had an underlying assumption that talent was a bell curve. Okay, and we're going to talk about the fact that talent is not a bell curve. The talent is everywhere. But when you think something is a bell curve, what do? You orient practice to that middle. And you say, we'll standardize it. We'll do one size fits all. And when you do that, it will work for some, for sure, but not for others. So when you think about the 20th century, and I'm not saying this critically, I'm saying the fact that we didn't understand the developing brain or how children learn when we designed that system. So then when you think about, if I were to tell you the year in which I learned the things I'm telling you, it's around 1985. Okay, so right now what's being asked of us is to recognize that there is a new science. And that new science has to make its way into our education systems in ways that are helpful to teachers and ask for a different design of schools based on the idea that talent's everywhere.
Yeah, and so that's challenging a really big assumption, especially in the context of our education system and how it's been structured, to your point, in terms of what our educators believe, in terms of what people believe, quite frankly. Because the context of some get it, some don't, is inherent to how we operate, I think, as a system. So playing devil's advocate, is talent really ubiquitous?
Let me tell you why it is. Okay, and let's think about you and me. Okay, our talents are jagged. Okay, we could do a column and say, what are you good at? And what are you less good at? And what am I good at? And what am I less good at? Our talent is a jagged profile. And because of that, what happens is, if you put children with a jagged profile into environments that were designed to nurture their interests and their beliefs, then you are going to see skills and talents in kids that you didn't know were there. But if you act as if talent is scarce, then what you are going to do is to select not just for talent, but for certain kinds of talent. And other kinds of talent may not be visible to you at all.
Mm-hmm. So if talent is everywhere, then how do we design schools to reveal it in a way that unlocks the student's potential?
Okay. So when you think about what it would take to design for that, there are two things that have to be at the core of our design. One of them is relationships, and the other is the intentional building of skills and mindsets. So when we think about what it would take for us to know and reveal the skills and talents of kids, the unlocking mechanism of the human relationship, I believe in you, I see your skills, I see you. And what I mean by intentional building of skills and mindsets is that skill development in kids is a progression. It's not something that you either have or you don't. Kids, I don't know, how many of you have heard about the building blocks for learning framework? Have any of you heard about it? Okay. Well, it's a little bit of a loaded question, but the building blocks for learning framework came out of a piece of work that we did at Turnaround where we asked, how does any child become a learner? Because in principle, if we knew how they could become a learner, then we could design classrooms to develop learners from any developmental starting point. When we read the literature on this, the framework actually fell out of the literature. And what we saw was a progression of skills, self-regulation, executive function, mindsets like belonging and growth mindset, and then higher order skills like self-direction, curiosity. So one of the things that we need to unlock and make visible the talents and skills of kids is to design classrooms to intentionally build those skills.
And you know, at Leap Innovations, we spend a lot of time trying to work with educators to do that and shift their practice. It's the core aspect of relationship skills, and the sense of belonging and belief is just dramatically, we've seen shifts as it relates to that. But I think, it's even more, right, in terms of, how do we really connect the shift of teacher practice to map how children develop and learn? There's just so much more that we need to be doing and that we need to know.
I think that what this change is asking for is a dramatic shift both at the pre-service and at the in-service level. Mm-hmm. Right now and throughout our history at Turnaround, it was upsetting to think that we were the source of information about the developing brain, about the science of learning and development. And by upsetting, I just mean that we want teachers to come into their practice knowing how children develop and how learning happens in kids. I think it's good if these things are reinforced in an in-service setting because practitioners know a lot too. Mm-hmm. But the foundations that I'm talking about today are not part of pre-service learning.
Yeah. What are some good examples? Can you share some?
Well, one of the things that I wanted to share with the audience is an incredible series of videos, 23 videos that were done by a group called Edutopia, George Lucas's organization. And here's why I would love for you to look at these videos. And that is because of how simple they are. Basically, they're videos of practice that's going on in this country right now, in charters, in non-charters, all across the country. And basically, we collaborated on this video series to show practices that are created by teachers that support the kind of skill development that we've been talking about. And on these videos, I narrate the science, and Linda Darling-Hammond narrates the practice. But when you see how simple some of these practices are that enable the forming of relationships, it's really remarkable. It's not high-tech, it's low-tech.
Yeah, I was interviewing Dr. Beverly Tatum yesterday, and she was talking about, the malleability of the brain. And, it's true for kids, it's true for adults, and this research that, demonstrated this sense of belonging or, this belief system, really, has some proof of closing the achievement gap. And so those videos that Pam is referencing are really terrific. And I think, again, it's like, how do we really design and embed this and scale this for all of our educators? Because it sounds like we're going to need to create a whole new generation. And that's not youth, but just generation of educators to really understand the science and apply them more specifically.
And when you think about the teachers that you work with at LEAP, what is their starting point? Oh,
I wish I could bring Erin Figula up here, who's our professional learning director, who's sitting in the audience. But we spend a lot of time helping educators really understand their why, right? I mean, people go into the education profession not to become rich, but to really make an impact on students. But we really put them in a construct that's to really support. We incent them to support this rank and sorting system that you were talking about. And so unpacking that has been is quite a journey. And for us, it really starts with helping educators understand their students' context, having them complete empathy walks, having them understand, talk to their students about what they like, what they don't like, learning their communities, learning about them from their parents, so they can really start developing these relationships. Conferencing with them regularly, helping them set goals, and then transferring that ownership of goals. So the students have that sense of belief, and they're building that agency and their confidence to know that there's an adult that deeply cares and believes that they can achieve. And one of our principals reminded me about a year ago and said, kids will rise up to the level of expectation that we set for them. We just need to raise the bar. And so it just reminds me that, it's not the kids.
Well, one of the things that you said before was this idea about knowing the why. And one of the pieces of experience that we've been having is that when teachers know the why in the science, it's really powerful for them. It's motivating, it's validating, and enables them to feel the reason behind a practice, not just doing the practice.
Yeah. So, the reason why, again, I'm so excited about the work that you've done is about the work that you're headed for in the future. And you have been championing, leading this massive national effort called the Science of Learning Development, and just received a sizable contribution from the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. Can you talk to the audience about what you hope that initiative is going to bring to the world?
So I want to tell you a story about how it started, because I think that frames where it needs to go. One of the things that's been very difficult in the field has been how many different names for things there are. So there is social and emotional learning, and there is whole child, and there are all of these different names and definitions for terms. And the way that the Science of Learning and Development Initiative actually began is because Jim Shelton, who was then Deputy Secretary but headed to Chan Zuckerberg, asked the question, well, what science should we pay attention to when we think about where 21st century learning should go? Well, if you ask 25 different people what science, you're going to get 25 different answers. So the initiative began as a way of answering that question by putting together an enormous group of scientists and reading a pretty vast literature to create a synthesis that was recently published in the last year in a journal called Applied Developmental Science. And it is a synthesis of how children develop, how they learn, and now stands as a beginning answer to that question in a way that can now support school design, classroom design, and practice design. So where we are right now in the initiative is we have a lot of work on what we call ecosystem, which is lots of organizations joining and engaging with us so that we begin to move the science much faster into education circles and practice circles. We have an R&D team that is working on measurement, which is to say measurement of a whole child, not measurement of one or two single skills. So this initiative is really about beginning to be a movement that changes the architecture and the assumptions behind the field.
It's so exciting because I've been on some of the calls, and just the construct or the opportunity to learn more about how students learn is core to that. Can you talk just a little bit more about what you're hoping to discover in that process and what it can mean, honestly, in terms of transforming education?
If I were to say two things that sit in the front of my mind, one is, what would a school actually look like if you put relationship and knowing children at the center of learning? Just think for a second about what it would have to look like if that was going to be true. We'd still have lots of kids, but we'd have to do something different in the way classrooms are designed in order to make that true. And then if I add to that, context drives the development of the brain. Okay, so that means that everything that is happening in the course of the day, every experience, tones of voice, ways of behaving with children when they get disappointed. If every teacher, every person in a school saw themselves as a brain builder, what would that mean to the way we design our classrooms? And when children struggle, what are the cues that they're going to pick up from the adults? Is it going to be, why are you doing that? Or is it going to be, how do I understand this child and what might be driving that behavior at this moment? But it is possible to create schools when we decide that the assumption is that talent is everywhere, and our assumptions about what children are capable of is very high.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Where do you think technology fits into this? This is a conference that is focused on innovation and technology. What are the implications of learning science to tech developers that are trying to design solutions in this new construct that you're describing?
When I think about, it's funny. This is my second time at this conference. Last year, I'm not sure I thought technology was a friend. This year, I've decided that technology is a friend. And either I've just been coerced and I don't know it yet, but I want to tell you why. One of the things that I think technology is wonderful for is for students to learn themselves and learn about themselves. And the existence of adaptive technologies that enable to make it just easier for adults in schools to know children. And then when I think about the possibility that technology is not just about content, that it's not about learning math or learning history, but what if when you learned content, you learned self-regulation, you learned executive function, you built your growth mindset or your sense of belonging. I feel now that we're really at the beginning of something that's going to be an integrated design effort. And when I say the word integration, I mean looking toward classrooms that support rich relationships, have integrated supports, intentional skill building, that integrate all of these things into an environment in which kids feel safe, feel a sense of belonging, and know that everybody believes in them.
Mm-hmm. I wonder how technology developers can, we've been talking about how educators, right, need to get access to the science and starting to incorporate these principles in their practice, how can technology developers access this? Because I think it's equally as important to the degree we need technology, which I think we do, to fully scale what we call personalized learning.
I think that part of why certainly I've invested in being here is because what I think this community is trying to do is to integrate across diverse fields and to begin the kind of inventive discovery of integrated practice that is possible and that is only going to happen if it is tech-enabled. But, you know, I think I remember when Todd Rose said to me why I should speak at this conference. And last year my talk was called Genes or Chemical Followers. And I was trying to figure out who would actually come to a talk about that. And I was fortunately pleasantly surprised. But I think there is right now still a pretty big barrier for this science getting into the world of tech and tech being something that feels like it can stay unitary, like learning math or learning history, as opposed to learning skill building.
Yeah, which is why the SOLD initiative is so critically important, because we've got to make those connections as well if we're going to fully transform this context. I think we actually have a few minutes for Q&A, if you're open to that.
That would be wonderful.
Awesome. Awesome. Yes.
So I had a question. So I'm Cece, and I live in...
Oh, just 1 second. I think they're going to bring a mic up. Thank you.
I live in Bellevue, Washington, in the Seattle area, and our local school district has chosen as its mission to send every child to college, which is an interesting mission, except that not every child is destined for college. And I was just in a session yesterday where one of our neighboring districts in a much more kind of struggling area had what seemed like a much more aligned mission, which was they wanted to know every child by name. They wanted to know their strengths, and they wanted to know their needs. And that resonated with me in a very different way. It seems much more aligned with what you're talking about is what children need, is that relationship that understands them as a person. How do you work with schools to embrace that, though? Because I have children with learning disabilities, and it's shocking to me. Often I'm on, the Department of Education's website, and they've got these miraculous tools and resources that are so well research-based, but they haven't, those mindsets haven't made their way into my children's schools. So how do you see making that transformation, and how long do you think it's going to take?
I want to give you a two-part answer, and I'm going to do something because of certain folks that are in the audience right now. But in the way that you framed the question, one of the things that the field struggles with is having academic rigor and academic growth living as if it is a choice with these other dimensions of learning that I'm talking about right now. And the fact is that rigorous learning and achievement can only happen if there is this kind of intentional skill building that I've been talking about. That having expectations absent the notion of nurturing those kinds of skills in kids is an empty promise. The thing I would like to do is, there are two people sitting there. One person who is a turnaround person, Mike Lamb, and a deputy chancellor of DC, Melissa Kim. And I think another answer to your question about how does a district begin to bring these two things together in an integrated way. Would you be willing to say a sentence or two about what you're...
Well, it is certainly not easy to do, and so much better with a good partner like Turnaround and their kind of toolkits and roadmap on how you start in the very beginning. Thank you so much. And so much easier to do with a good partner like Turnaround, who developed a roadmap on how you start and what comes first, second, and third. Even while we're sitting here, though, listening to Pam, we just came up with another idea to say, well, how come we don't actually integrate all of this learning to our assistant principal training? Because they're our future leaders, right? And so while we're doing all this work, training our central office leaders and principals to do this, we're finding in every conversation ways to integrate this into the development of all people and all adults. I've been in a separate conversation, going to lots of high school redesign conversations, and wanting to learn a lot from what Leap Innovations is doing. But in these two redesigns of high schools, how do we make sure that we ask the question Pam just asked about, what does it take to actually create a school that is based solely on relationships coming first, and with the deep knowledge and commitment from every level of that school and that district, that relationships really matter, and how we respond to students at the expected moment of struggle, both academic and or emotional. How do adults respond to that? How do we prepare for that moment so that it's not left up to chance and left up to how you're feeling in that mood that day or how that emotion goes? What would you like to add, Michael?
I think the thing that sticks out to me about the question that you asked speaks to the importance of integration. And that we kind of think of the new thing that we hear as the thing that now needs to happen. And the idea of a kid feeling known, seen, and heard as being so important. But it's also important that they're academically challenged, that we are pushing a rigorous cognitive development at the same time. And all the science says that we need all of these things to be happening at the same time. We always say that the same brain that's trying to figure out what happened to me last night at home with my stepfather is the same brain that's trying to figure out what 4 times 8 is. And if we think about these as isolated things that we're working on, then we won't get our full potential maximized. And so the concept of integration is so important. And so that's why I think we would say that, yes, it's really important that you have children who are supported and have those relationships, but they also need to be challenged at the same time. And so we need systems that actually represent that full idea. And in DC, we have a deputy chancellor who is the deputy chancellor of social, emotional, and academic development, sending a signal to everybody that it's their responsibility to do all of those things in an integrated way, and that's what the science says.
That's awesome. Any other questions? Yes.
Thanks. I don't know if this question's fully cooked, so bear with me. How do you get a system that responds to academic performance to care and change in order to measure learning, which is not the same as academic performance? And secondly, how much more sophisticated is learning than our ability to assess learning through cognitive skills assessments? I know learning is a cognitive process, cognition's malleable, but the tools we use to measure learning are more primitive than learning itself, which is very sophisticated.
The unfortunate thing is that I agree with you that sorry, I think our assessments are simplistic, but I think there is a lot of interesting work going on, even as part of the Science of Learning and Development initiative that we're working with. And what I mean by that is there actually are dynamic systems methodologies that would enable us to look at the development of children's skills in context. And the methodologies are mathematical tools, but the way that we would assess children is much more well-rounded, many, many more points of measurement, and use the mathematics to be able to look at change over time within a given context. Now, those things exist in research settings, to be sure, but there is a lot of work going on to make those measurements actually come out of academia.
Yeah, one more. Back here?
No, right here. Jean.
Jane? Oh.
So how does one, how do you guard against moving back to PE-Ed reform days, when a lot of educators in a lot of schools thought their job was to care for kids, and therefore their focus was not as much on the academics, which turned into what we had in the O's So there's this fear of how do you implement
Yep.
and not let schools off the hook for the job.
That's right.
Yep. First of all, it is a tremendous disservice to a child to not believe in what that child is capable of. The way that I began this talk was to put what do we believe children are capable of at the top. Okay, talent is everywhere. It's not a bell curve. So once you say that, then you say that, okay, then our responsibility in the ways that we design schools is to nurture and discover what children are capable of. And that bar is very, very high. What people often ask me when I say that is, Pam, are you saying that you think there's a Mozart in every child? And we just need an environment to bring it out. And my answer is, I don't believe there's a Mozart in every child. But right now, the way our classrooms are designed, we wouldn't know if Mozart was there. So if we have this view that we need to discover what children are capable of, and what is on us is to create the environments in which that is possible. And that isn't choosing touchy-feely SEL over rigorous problem-solving, analytic skills, and all of the important 21st century skills that we want children to have.
Thank you, Pam, because we have to do both.
We have to
It's not
do
an
both.
either or, it has to be both. And I do believe we are at a tipping point, largely because of you and the leadership that you have had in this work, Pam, of turning the corner that's going to enable our school systems to do both. And I just want to thank you for your time this afternoon. Let's
you,
please
Phyllis.
join me in a round of applause for Pam Cantor.
Thank you.